The VIP boardroom of the global tech giant is frozen in a chilling silence as the Japanese delegation prepares to leave, offended by a critical mistranslation. Arya, the arrogant young CEO, snaps in fury at Kenji, a single father quietly cleaning a spill on the floor. She shoves his hand away and sneers, "Janitors don't have a voice here. You are just polluting the air." Kenji stands slowly, looking directly at the disappointed Mr. Tanaka. He speaks in a flawless, imperial Japanese tone, radiating power. "Mr. Tanaka, this error was not the company's intent. Let me clarify the terms in your own language." Arya drops her files, her face turning ghostly pale. She has no idea she just insulted a high-ranking former diplomat hiding in shadows to protect his daughter. Before we explore the mystery behind Kenji's true identity, let me know which country you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss these shocking revelations. The sunrise over the city was a cold, pale gold. But Kenji had been awake for hours. In the quiet dimness of his tiny apartment, he moved with the practiced silence of a ghost. He packed a simple lunch for his 6-year-old daughter, Mickey, carefully cutting the fruit into the shapes of flowers. Every morning was a ritual of survival and love. Mickey was the only reason he drew breath, the only light in a world that had once tried to swallow him whole. To the neighbors, Kenji was a man of few words, a hard-working single father who left for work before the buses started running, wearing a faded blue uniform that smelled faintly of lemon bleach and industrial soap. But beneath that uniform lay a history written in the halls of power and international intrigue. 3 years ago, Kenji was not a janitor. He was a titan of linguistics, an elite diplomatic interpreter who moved between presidents and emperors. He had possessed the rare gift of translating not just words, but the very souls of nations. However, knowledge is a dangerous burden. After witnessing a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the shadow government, an operation that put a target on his family's back, Kenji chose to die to the world. He vanished, burying his brilliance under a layer of dust and floor wax, believing that if he became invisible, Mickey would be safe. He arrived at the headquarters of Vance Global Tech, a monolith of glass and steel that seemed to touch the clouds. Here, Kenji was less than a person. He was a background element, a shadow that moved when the important people entered the room. He spent his days scrubbing the floors where billionaire deals were made, his eyes fixed on the tiles, never daring to show the fire of intelligence that still burned in his mind. In the penthouse executive suite, Arya, the youngest CEO in the history of the company, was fighting a losing battle. She was brilliant, yes, but her brilliance was sharpened into a blade of arrogance. She viewed the world through the lens of hierarchy, believing that power was shouted, not whispered. Today, the fate of her empire hung by a thread. A massive partnership with the Tanaka Group was the only thing standing between her company and a hostile takeover. The boardroom was stifling. On one side of the petrified wood table sat Mr. Tanaka, a man whose silence was as heavy as a mountain. On the other sat Arya, her face a mask of mounting frustration. Between them sat the official interpreter, a man Arya had hired for his expensive pedigree. What Arya didn't know was that the interpreter had been bought. Every word he translated was a subtle distortion, a poison designed to make Tanaka believe Arya was insulting his ancestors and his honor. Tanaka's face hardened. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor like a death knell. The atmosphere was explosive. Arya, sensing her empire slipping away, looked for someone to blame for the sudden tension. Her eyes landed on Kenji, who was quietly mopping a coffee spill near the doorway. "You!" Arya snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "I told you to clear out! Your presence is distracting, and frankly, you're just making the air in here feel heavy and cheap. Get your things and get out before I have security throw you out of the building." Kenji didn't move. He looked at the floor, then at the interpreter, who was wearing a smug, hidden smile. Kenji heard the last sentence the interpreter had spoken to Tanaka, a lie that suggested the Japanese firm was merely a stepping stone for Arya's ambition. Kenji felt the old weight of responsibility pressing against his chest. If he stayed silent, thousands of families, the janitors, the clerks, the technicians, would lose their livelihoods when the company collapsed. He looked at the exit, thinking of Miki. Then he looked at Mr. Tanaka's disappointed eyes. Kenji dropped the mop. The sound of the handle hitting the floor echoed like a gunshot. He didn't look like a janitor as he straightened his spine. He looked like a man who had walked through fire and emerged as cold as steel. He ignored Arya's gasp of outrage and stepped forward, placing himself between the two worlds. The shadow was gone. The diplomat had returned. The silence in the boardroom was no longer empty. It was pressurized, a physical weight that made the air feel thin. Arya's mouth hung open, her hand frozen in midair as she prepared to call security. The hired interpreter's face drained of color, his eyes darting toward the exit. But Kenji stood at the head of the table, his posture as straight and unyielding as a katana blade. The faded blue fabric of his janitor's uniform seemed to transform, no longer a mark of poverty, but a cloak of profound humility. Kenji ignored Arya entirely. He focused his gaze on Mr. Tanaka, his eyes projecting a level of respect and understanding that transcended mere business. When he spoke, the sound was like a deep temple bell, resonant, ancient, and undeniably powerful. He didn't just speak Japanese. He used keigo, the ultra-polite imperial-level honorifics that are almost a lost art, reserved for the highest echelons of Tokyo's elite. "Honorable Tanaka-sama," Kenji began, his voice flowing with a rhythmic grace. "Please forgive the intrusion of a man who sweeps the floors, but the winds of misunderstanding have blown too coldly through this room. The words you were given were not the heart of this house. They were shadows cast by a flickering candle." Mr. Tanaka, who had already reached for his briefcase, froze. He looked at Kenji, really looked at him, and his eyes widened. He recognized the tone. He recognized the dialect. It was the language of the imperial palace, a level of sophistication that no common translator could ever mimic. Arya stepped forward, her face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and rage. "Kenji, what on earth are you doing? Stop this nonsense at once. You're just a—" Kenji turned his head slightly. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer weight of his presence stopped Arya in her tracks. "Be silent, Arya-san," he said in English, his tone devoid of its usual softness. "You have built a mountain of glass, but you do not know how to walk upon it without shattering everything. If you speak one more word of arrogance, you will lose everything your father worked for. Sit down." The room gasped. Never in the history of the company had a service worker spoken to the CEO with such absolute authority. To Arya's own surprise, her knees felt weak. She sank into her leather chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched, mesmerized, as the man she had called trash took control of the most important negotiation of her life. For the next 30 minutes, Kenji became a bridge. He dismantled the lies the crooked interpreter had planted, word by word. He didn't just translate the contract, he explained the philosophy behind it. He spoke of wa, the Japanese concept of harmony, and how Arya's company, despite its flaws, held a spark of innovation that could change the world. He spoke of the long-term vision, of legacy, and of the sacred trust between partners. The crooked interpreter tried to intervene, his voice shaking. "He's lying! He's just a janitor! He doesn't know the technical terms!" Kenji didn't even look at him. He simply reached out and pointed to a specific clause in the Japanese version of the document. "You translated fiscal liability as moral bankruptcy, and you intentionally used the word for servant instead of partner when referring to Tanaka-sama's engineers. You were not translating, you were sabotaging. Leave this room before I report your license to the International Bureau." The man turned and fled, the heavy doors thudding shut behind him. The negotiation continued, but the energy had shifted. Tanaka was no longer a cold judge. He was an engaged listener. He asked questions that he had previously deemed too complex for Arya, and Kenji answered them with a mastery of economics and international law that left Arya breathless. By the time the sun had moved across the sky, a deal that had been dead was brought back to life. Mr. Tanaka stood up, but he didn't look at Arya. He walked toward Kenji and performed a deep 90-degree bow, a gesture of respect so profound that it made the other Japanese delegates bow as well. "I came here expecting to find a leader," Tanaka said in Japanese, his voice soft with awe. "I did not expect to find a master of the way. Your wisdom has saved more than just a contract today, Kenji-san. It has saved my faith in this partnership." As the delegation filed out of the room, leaving a stunned silence in their wake, Arya stood alone at the massive table. She looked at Kenji, who was already picking up the mop he had dropped earlier. He was hunched over again, his shoulders resuming the posture of a man who wanted to be invisible. "Who are you?" Arya whispered, her voice trembling. "That wasn't just Japanese. My father had translators from Harvard who couldn't speak like that. You looked like a king standing there." Kenji didn't look up as he began to mop the floor again, the rhythmic sound of the water against the tile the only noise in the room. "I told you, Arya-san. I am a man who wants the floor to be clean. A clean floor is a safe place for a child to run." "No," Arya said, stepping closer, her arrogance replaced by a raw, burning curiosity. "A janitor doesn't know the Keigo of the royal court. A janitor doesn't know the secrets of the Helios merger. You saved me. Why?" Kenji stopped. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting a sadness that went back 1,000 years. "I didn't save you, Arya-san. I saved the 5,000 workers whose families depend on your signature. Power is not a crown to be worn. It is a weight to be carried. Perhaps today, you have finally started to feel the weight." Without another word, Kenji walked out of the boardroom, leaving the most powerful woman in the city standing in the shadows of her own empire, realizing that the most important voice in her world had been the one she had tried to silence. The following evening, the glass towers of the city felt like a suffocating cage to Arya. The headlines were screaming about the miracle merger, and her board of directors was singing her praises. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the calm, weary face of the man who had saved her. She realized she didn't even know his last name. She only knew that he lived in a world she had spent her entire life looking down upon. Driven by a restless need to understand, Arya ignored her chauffeur and took a taxi to the address she had pulled from the human resources files. The neighborhood was a maze of narrow alleys and leaning apartment buildings, where the scent of laundry detergent and cheap cooking oil replaced the expensive perfumes of her world. It was a place where people didn't have careers. They had lives held together by grit and hope. She found the building, a weathered brick structure with a flickering hallway light. As she reached the 3rd floor, she heard a sound that stopped her breath. It was Kenji's voice, but it wasn't the powerful, imperial tone of the boardroom. It was soft, melodic, and filled with a playful tenderness as he sang a Japanese lullaby. Arya peered through the partially open door. The apartment was tiny, barely larger than her walk-in closet, yet it was impeccably clean. There were no gilded frames or marble statues, only shelves of worn books and a small table covered in hand-drawn pictures. In the center of the room, Kenji was sitting on the floor, patiently helping Mickey build a castle out of old cardboard boxes. "And this tower is for the brave knight," Kenji whispered, his eyes glowing with a light Arya had never seen. "But Daddy," Mickey giggled, "who will protect the knight when he gets tired?" Kenji pulled the little girl into a hug, kissing the top of her head. "The knight has a secret, Miki. He isn't brave because he has a sword. He is brave because he has a princess to come home to. As long as you are safe, the knight can never be defeated." Arya felt a lump form in her throat. She realized that while she had spent millions to build a legacy of steel and glass, Kenji had built a fortress of love out of cardboard and whispers. She knocked softly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Kenji looked up. The warmth in his eyes vanished instantly, replaced by the guarded, iron gaze of the man who lived in the shadows. He stood up slowly, ushering Mickey into the small bedroom before stepping into the hallway and closing the door behind him. "You should not be here, Arya-san," he said, his voice flat. "The contract is signed. My work for you is finished." "I didn't come for the contract, Kenji," Arya said, her voice trembling. "I came because I realized I've spent my life being a CEO, but I've forgotten how to be a human being. I wanted to thank you properly. and I wanted to know why. Kenji leaned against the peeling wallpaper of the hallway, his shoulders dropping just an inch. Why what? Why hide? A man with your genius. You could be the president of a nation, or at least a king of industry. Why choose a mop and a bucket? Kenji remained silent for a long moment, the sounds of the city humming outside the window. 3 years ago, he began, his voice dropping into a somber frequency. I was the lead interpreter for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I was the bridge for a deal that involved a global energy cartel. I translated a conversation I was never meant to hear. A plan to orchestrate a famine in a developing nation just to drive up the price of oil. I thought I could expose them. I thought the truth was a shield. He looked at the closed bedroom door, his expression etched with a profound, lingering terror. They didn't come for me. They came for my wife. It wasn't an accident, Arya-san. It was a message. They told me that if I ever spoke another word in public, Miki would be next. So I died. I buried the interpreter, the diplomat, and the linguist. I became a ghost because ghosts are the only ones who can protect their children. Arya stood frozen, the weight of his sacrifice crashing down on her. She thought of her own petty grievances, her arrogance over stock prices and office politics, and felt a burning shame. I am so sorry, Kenji. I had no idea. Humility is not found in knowing everything, Arya-san, Kenji said softly. It is found in realizing that everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. You walked into that boardroom thinking you were the only one who mattered. You saw a janitor, not a man. I want to make it right, Arya said, her eyes burning with a new, fierce determination. I don't want you to be a janitor anymore. I need a consultant, someone who can teach me to lead with a heart instead of a fist. But more than that, I want to help you fight back. The people who did this to you, they are the same ones trying to sabotage my company. The interpreter I hired, he was on their payroll. Kenji's eyes sharpened. For the first time, Arya saw a spark of the old warrior, the man who had once stood between empires. They are coming for Vance Global? They want the technology we developed for clean water, Arya explained. They want to monetize it, to control it. They aren't just my rivals, Kenji. They are the monsters who took your wife. Let me help you. Stay in the shadows if you must, but don't let them win. Don't let them keep you silent forever. The silence in the hallway stretched, thick with the weight of a life-changing decision. Kenji looked at his calloused hands, the hands that had cleaned 1,000 floors to keep his daughter fed. Then he looked at Arya. He saw the change in her, the way her arrogance had been replaced by a raw, genuine empathy. I will help you, Kenji said finally, but not for money, and not for a title. I will do it because Miki deserves a world where the people in charge aren't afraid of the truth. Over the next few weeks, a secret transformation took place within the walls of the Vance Corporation. Arya became a student. She spent her nights at Kenji's small table, learning the nuances of Eastern philosophy and the art of subtle negotiation. She learned that a leader's greatest power is the ability to listen, and that true loyalty cannot be bought. It must be earned through kindness. She began to visit Miki, bringing books and teaching the little girl about the stars. She saw the way Miki looked at her father, not as a janitor, but as a hero who could fix anything. Arya realized that she was no longer just protecting a company, she was protecting a family. And in return, Kenji was giving her something she had never had, a soul. But as they grew closer to uncovering the conspiracy, the shadows began to move. The enemies who had silenced Kenji once before were realizing that the ghost had returned. And this time, they wouldn't just send a message. They would try to finish what they started. As Kenji watched Arya walk to her car one evening, he felt the familiar chill of danger in the air. He knew the war was coming. He looked at the mop leaning against his wall, and then at the leather-bound book Arya had given him. He realized he could no longer be just a father in hiding. To protect his princess, the knight would have to pick up his sword once more. The celebration for the Tanaka merger was supposed to be a triumph of light, held at the glass-walled pavilion of the Vance estate. But as the cherry blossoms drifted onto the polished stone floors, A cold, unnatural stillness settled over the night. Kenji stood in the shadows of the catering entrance, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's precision. He wasn't wearing his blue uniform tonight. He was dressed in a dark, traditional kimono, a ghost of his ancestral past. He felt the familiar itch between his shoulder blades, the feeling of being hunted. It happened in a heartbeat. The lights flickered and died, plunging the pavilion into a sea of ink. A sharp, muffled cry echoed from the garden, and then silence. By the time the emergency generators kicked in, the room was in chaos. Arya was gone. Mickey, who had been sitting at a small table nearby, was gone. Only a single white carnation lay on the floor, the calling card of the man who had stolen Kenji's wife 3 years ago. Kenji didn't panic. Panic was for those who still had something to lose. He had already lost his world once. He would not let it happen again. He walked to the center of the room, his presence so commanding that the screaming socialites fell silent. He pulled a burner phone from his sleeve and dialed a number that had been etched into his memory for a decade. "The dragon has woken," Kenji said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "Tell the shadows to gather at the old shipyard. If a single hair is harmed on their heads, I will not just burn the city, I will erase your name from history." The shipyard was a graveyard of rusted steel and broken dreams. In the center of a hollowed-out warehouse, Arya and Mickey were tied to chairs, surrounded by men in dark suits. At the center stood Sato, a man with a face like a serpent and a soul like a void. He was the architect of the famine, the man who had ordered the death of Kenji's wife. 3 years, Kenji, Sato sneered as the heavy iron doors groaned open. 3 years of hiding behind a mop. Did you really think you could play the hero again? Look at you. You are nothing but a janitor who forgot his place. Kenji stepped into the light. He didn't carry a gun. He didn't carry a blade. He walked with the heavy, deliberate tread of a man who owned the very air he breathed. "I never forgot my place, Sato," Kenji said, his voice echoing through the hollow warehouse like a clap of thunder. "I chose to clean floors because the world was too dirty for my daughter. But you are a stain that cannot be scrubbed away. You must be removed." "Kill him!" Sato barked, waving a hand toward his armed guards. But as the men moved to raise their weapons, their phones began to chime in a terrifying, synchronized chorus. One by one, the guards froze, their faces turning a sickly shade of gray as they looked at their screens. "What is this?" Sato screamed. "What are you waiting for?" "I am not just a linguist, Sato," Kenji said, his eyes burning with a cold blue fire. "Language is the foundation of power. I have spent the last hour speaking to your creditors, your allies, and your superiors in the Shadow Cabinet. In 14 different languages, I have told them the truth about your embezzlement. As of 3 minutes ago, your bank accounts are empty. Your warrants have been issued in 7 countries. You aren't a king anymore. You are a debt that is about to be collected." Suddenly, the shadows of the warehouse seemed to come alive. Men in black suits, traditional Japanese enforcers, stepped from the darkness, surrounding Sato's guards. These were the men Kenji had once protected, the ones who owed him a debt of honor that time could not erase. Kenji walked toward the chairs, ignoring the guns pointed at his chest. He reached out and untied Mickey first, pulling her into a brief, fierce embrace. "Close your eyes, my princess," he whispered. "The night is here." Then he turned to Arya. As he sliced through her ropes, her eyes met his, filled with a mixture of terror and absolute awe. She realized then that the man who cleaned her floors was more powerful than any CEO she had ever met. Sato realized he had lost, pulled a hidden dagger and lunged toward Kenji in a fit of desperate rage. Kenji didn't flinch. With a movement so fast it was a blur, he caught Sato's wrist, twisting it until the bones snapped like a dry twig. He leaned in, his face inches from the man who had ruined his life. "I could kill you now," Kenji whispered, his voice a jagged edge of ice. But death is too clean for a man like you. You will live to see your empire crumble. You will live in a cell, listening to the silence of a world that has forgotten you. That is the true Keigo of justice. Kenji stood up, his kimono fluttering in the cold wind. He looked at the men who had come to his aid and gave a single, sharp nod. Within seconds, Sato and his men were dragged into the darkness, leaving the warehouse silent once more. Arya stood up, her legs trembling. She looked at Kenji, not the janitor, but the king in the black silk. You called them. You used your voice. Kenji looked at his hands, then at Miki, who was tucked under his arm. Sometimes, Arya-san, the only way to keep the world clean is to pick up the sword one last time. Arya reached out, touching the sleeve of his kimono. What happens now? You can't go back to the shadows. Not after this. Kenji looked out at the city lights, the diplomat and the father finally merging into one soul. I am done hiding, Arya. But I am also done sweeping up the messes of men like Sato. If we are to build a new world, we must do it together, with a voice that speaks for those who cannot be heard. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Kenji picked up his daughter and walked toward the light, leaving the ghosts of the shipyard behind. He was no longer a man of shadows. He was a man of truth. And for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't afraid to speak. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom once again, but this time, the air felt different. It was no longer heavy with the scent of secrets and corporate greed. The Vance Global Tech headquarters remained a giant of glass and steel, but the soul within its walls had been transformed. Kenji walked through the main lobby at 8 o'clock in the morning. He was no longer wearing the faded blue uniform or carrying a heavy bucket of bleach. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his presence commanding the respect of every employee who passed him. Yet, as he reached the center of the lobby, he did something that made the newcomers pause in confusion. He stopped by a small spill near a potted palm tree, took a silk handkerchief from his pocket, and quietly wiped it away. He moved to the top floor where the CEO's office door now bore 2 names: Arya Vance and Kenji Sato, co-presidents. Arya was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city she once tried to conquer with arrogance. When she heard the door open, she didn't turn with a sharp command. She turned with a smile that reached her eyes, a smile that Kenji had taught her to find. The morning reports are in, Arya said, her voice soft but filled with a new, resonant strength. The Clean Water Project in the southern provinces has been completed. For the first time in a decade, 10,000 families have a voice because they have their health. Kenji walked to his desk, a simple wooden table that he insisted on cleaning himself every morning. Power is only meaningful when it serves those who have none, Arya-san. We are no longer building glass towers. We are building bridges. At that moment, the door burst open and a blur of pink silk and laughter collided with Kenji's legs. Miki, now healthy and glowing with happiness, looked up at her father. Daddy! Arya! The birds in the garden are singing in Japanese today. I think they are saying thank you. Arya knelt down, adjusting Miki's hair with a tenderness that would have been unthinkable a year ago. She looked at Kenji, the man who had traded his mop for a seat at the table of power, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. I used to think that janitors didn't have a voice here, she whispered, her eyes shining. But I realize now that your voice was the only one that was ever truly honest. She stood up and looked at Kenji, practicing a sentence she had been rehearsing for weeks. In a soft, slightly hesitant but beautiful Japanese, she said, Watashi tachi ni shin no koe o ataete kurete. Arigato. Thank you for giving us a true voice. Kenji smiled, a rare, brilliant expression that erased the years of shadow from his face. He looked at the woman who had become his partner, and the daughter who was his world. Every profession has a voice, Arya-san. From the one who sweeps the floor to the one who signs the laws. As long as we speak with kindness, the world will listen. As they walked out together toward the elevator, the sun caught the gold lettering on the wall. Vance Sato Global, leading with heart. The Janitor King and the empowered CEO stepped into the light, finally home, finally heard, and finally free. A person's true value lies in their brain and their heart, not the clothes they wear or the tools they carry. Kenji's story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who isn't afraid to pick up a mop. If you believe in the quiet strength of humble heroes, please hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts below. Thank you for being part of Kenji and Arya's incredible journey.